What's the best way for landlords to rent out their properties? Fixed term or periodic? Let's find out. Property investors often ask, should I rent my property out on a fixed term or a periodic tenancy, and what's the difference between the two? Well, in this video, you're going to learn the differences and then get an honest review of both the pros and the cons of each, and that way you can decide which is best for you. A fixed term tenancy is where you and your tenant sign a contract that ends after a certain period of time, say 12 months. Now, you're both locked in for that period, and that means that you as a landlord can't move your tenants on while the contract is in place, and the tenant, well, they're not allowed to leave either unless they find someone to replace them. Compare that to a periodic tenancy where there's no fixed end date. That means the tenant can leave at any time with 4 weeks notice, and you as the property investor can end the tenancy for a couple of reasons, like if you want to sell the property, if you want to renovate extensively, if you as the landlord want to move in, or if you want to move in a family member or employee. Okay, now that we know the two types of tenancies, let's go through the pros and cons of each. The first benefit of a periodic tenancy is that some tenants will end up staying longer. Think about it. If you know your tenancy is due to end in 3 months and you're a tenant, that acts as a trigger for you to think about your living situation if you're on a fixed term. Now, you're going to be thinking, well, am I going to move or am I going to stay? Whereas if there's no set end date because you're on periodic and you're happy living there, might just continue on. But the real benefit of periodic tenancies is that you as a landlord have a lot of flexibility. Look, realistically, there aren't that many reasons you can kick your tenants out. But if you plan to sell the property, if you plan to move into it yourself, you can do that on periodic. Whereas with a fixed term tenancy, you either have to come to an agreement with your tenant or wait for that fixed term to end. And I'll give you an example. Although I'm a property investor, I currently rent where I live. Now, my landlord called me up the other day, said, Ed, I want to sell the property. Now, I'm currently on a fixed term and my lease doesn't run out for another 4 months. So she is going to sell the property with my lease in place. Now, that's going to make the property less attractive to owner-occupiers who want to buy the property to live in themselves. Now, if I was on a periodic tenancy, she could sell the property and let buyers know that they can get it with what's called vacant possession. That's where people can buy it without a tenant already in place. Now, that is generally more attractive. The downside of a periodic tenancy is that your tenant, though, can leave at any time with 4 weeks notice. Now, that can mean that your tenant gives notice at a time where there's not a lot of tenants looking for properties to rent, and that can make some landlords anxious. The other impact is that you have longer periods of vacancy. Now, that's because once your tenant hands in their notice, you've only got 4 weeks to get photos of the property, advertise the property, find a tenant, and then get them to move in. That might not all happen in 4 weeks, so your property remains empty, not earning any rent for a couple of weeks. Whereas if you had a fixed term tenancy in place, you can have that conversation 2 to 3 months out, see if your tenant wants to keep living in the property. And if they don't, you've got that longer runway to find a new tenant. So since we now have covered both the pros and cons of periodic tenancies, let's talk about fixed term. The good thing about fixed term tenancies is that your tenants are locked in for the length of the tenancy. Now that means there's less risk for you as a landlord because you know your rent is locked in. This can be particularly useful if you're renting to university students because they may only want a property from February through to November during the main 2 semesters. Well, that can mean vacancy, not having any rent coming in during the Christmas period. But if they signed a 12-month fixed term, then you have guaranteed rent throughout the whole year. And from our experience here at Opus Partners, tenants often like fixed term too because they also have the property locked in. They're not at risk of the landlord giving them notice, kicking them out. This is particularly useful for young families where parents want their kids to keep attending the same school throughout the year at an ongoing basis and still want a property within that school zone. The downside, though, is that fixed terms aren't flexible. So one of our investors decided not to go with a fixed term tenancy because they thought, I might like to move into that property within the next year or so. Well, if they went on a fixed term, they'd have to wait until that term ended, whereas if they went on periodic, they can give notice at any time. But even though fixed terms have advantages, recent legal changes have blunted their usefulness. So do they still have a place? In 2021, the government changed the rules for fixed-term tenancies. Rather than ending once the fixed term ends, fixed-term tenancies now automatically become periodic as soon as the fixed term ends. That is, unless you and your tenant agree to a new fixed term. So you might be wondering, are fixed-term tenancies still relevant? The answer is yes, because they still give landlords certainty that they'll have a tenant for the next year, for example. But they are also still relevant for tenants. And just before we get into the reason why, if you're enjoying learning about property investment, make sure you hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. As part of the Opus Group, we have our own property management company, Venture Management. And what we've found is that around half of the tenants on fixed-term tenancies end up renewing that fixed term, even though they could just go on periodic. Why? Why wouldn't tenants just prefer the flexibility of periodic? Well, like landlords, they also want certainty. In this case, certainty that they can stay in their home, that they're not going to have to move on within a certain period. So generally speaking, because fixed terms work for landlords and they work for tenants, we tend to recommend that you go for a fixed term unless you think that you're going to need flexibility to sell or move into the property within the next 12 months.